Bolliger and Mabillard, or B&M for short, is one of the most successful roller coaster manufacturers in the world. And despite their reputation for smooth roller coasters, B&M might just have a roughness problem, with their coasters becoming increasingly rough over the past couple of years. But what is actually going on, and what could even be causing this problem? Well, let's find out. B&M opened up in 1988, building their first roller coaster in 1990, an Iron Wolf at Six Flags Great America. And just 2 years later, B&M would build their first Batman the Ride clone. Batman the Ride was a revolutionary concept, being an inverted roller coaster in which the rider is hanging below the tracks, featuring multiple inversions, and overall being a very intense ride experience. Following the original Batman the Ride, B&M would go on to build multiple other steel roller coasters, and many more Batman the Ride clones, which would all gain a reputation for being incredibly smooth. This was especially sought after in the age of Vekoma SLCs and boomerangs, along with rougher wooden roller coasters and older steel ones too. Parks simply wanted smoother and more comfortable roller coasters at their parks, which is exactly what B&M was delivering. A smooth, comfortable ride experience that was super marketable and still a lot of fun. This caused rapid growth for the company, and it was said that B&M was often booked out multiple years in advance, meaning it was very difficult for parks to get a B&M roller coaster. And with the introduction of the Hyper roller coaster in 1999, B&M's reputation for creating incredibly smooth roller coasters only continued to increase, with nearly every single B&M roller coaster in existence at the time being a very smooth ride. And of course, some coasters were still smoother than others, like the Hyper coasters were still much smoother than the stand-up coasters. But in general, B&M was known for very smooth and comfortable roller coasters. However, this all began to change with the introduction of the B&M dive coaster. Specifically, B&M dive coasters featuring vest restraints. Valravn, or Valravn, whatever you want to say, was the first B&M dive coaster to feature vest restraints, which was a newer type of restraint that was put in place of the traditional over-the-shoulder restraint to minimize headbang. However, these trains, especially on dive coasters, seem to have a bit of a problem, and that is the fact that the seats on the end of the train can actually be quite rough, a problem that was not previously on dive coasters with the traditional trains. And while Valravn and Yukon Striker really haven't had any major issues with roughness, since 2022, every dive coaster that's been built have had complaints of it being rough. And it all kind of started with Emperor at SeaWorld San Diego. This coaster was one of the first quote-unquote mini dive coasters. Basically a smaller, cheaper, slightly scaled down version of the larger dive coasters like Valravn. These typically feature shorter 6-row trains, of course with the vest restraints. But here's where our problem begins, because shortly after opening, people were beginning to complain that Emperor was becoming increasingly rough, especially on the seats farthest from the wheels, which would be the first or the sixth seat in each row. Meaning the farther you got away from the center of the train in each row, the rougher the ride became. And at this point we're all thinking, oh, maybe it was just a bit of a fluke. Maybe something happened and this coaster just isn't as smooth as the others. But then comes Dr. Diabolical's cliffhanger at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. And guess what? This coaster was completely fine, with no major reports of this coaster being particularly rough or anything like that. So at this point, it just seems like Emperor was just a one-time thing of a B&M coaster kind of being a little bit rough. Next, B&M manufactured Pipeline the Surf Coaster, which I got to ride just a couple months after opening. And I must say, there was definitely a noticeable rattle in the back of the train, but I'll give them a pass on this one since this was a prototype attraction. However, the next two major roller coasters that B&M would build would have some serious problems with roughness, with one of them being Iron Menace at Dorney Park. Immediately after this ride opened, we were getting reports that this thing could be very rough on the outside seats. And keep in mind, this was people riding it literally opening day saying this. Like even with Emperor, it was a couple days, like a couple months or whatever before we started hearing people saying it was rough, but this was literally opening day. And some people were saying it was even like bad enough to give you a headache rough in the outside seats, which is very uncharacteristic of a B&M roller coaster. So this kind of had everyone wondering what was going on with B&M. But then Penguin Trek at SeaWorld Orlando opened up. And again, it was another B&M roller coaster with many reports of roughness immediately as it opened. And while yes, this is not a dive coaster, it was still a B&M coaster with a significant rattle that many people still thought was rough. And these are just a couple of well-known examples. 20 years ago, it would have been unheard of for B&M to produce 1, 2, 3, 4 coasters in the span of 2 or so years that were considered rough by many people. And I must say, this is a very odd and unexpected change. Because think about it, nothing's really changed about B&M. And while yes, these are I guess maybe different train and like ride designs or ride types, but the track has stayed the same, the designers have pretty much stayed the same, and even the trains, a lot of them didn't have problems. Like the dive coaster trains, they didn't have problems on Yukon Striker or Valraven. It's just these newer coasters that it's really affecting. And even when you look at the B&Ms of Kings Island, my home park, and yes, I know apparently the soil does something to make these coasters slightly rougher than they normally would be, but even then, Diamondback has gotten very, very rough these last 2 or 3 years. Like my first ride on Diamondback, it didn't have much of a rattle, but in the back row, for this probably about past year or so, it has been borderline rough, especially in some of the valleys. And we all know that Banshee can be pretty rough at times, and we know it can be a little bit inconsistent. Like I've had super smooth rides on Banshee, and then I've had some rides where Banshee is super rough. And you know, Orion's not rough now, but 10 years down the road, is it going to have a serious rattle? Again, we just don't know. And with the trend that many B&M roller coasters have been on recently, it is pretty likely that Orion will have a pretty significant rattle within the next decade or so. So, what exactly could be causing this? Now, I'm not going to speculate too much because I am no roller coaster engineer, but just looking at it from a logical perspective, it's probably either the quality of the steel or the track or whatever has reduced, or like the quality of the welding or how well it's put together has been reduced in some way from previous years. It could also be train designs. I've also noticed that like wing coasters can get fairly rough in those outside seats. So maybe it's just the design of these dive coasters to where you're farther from the wheel chassis and everything, and it just makes the coaster more rough. And again, we don't exactly know, but if I had to take a guess, it's probably one of those two things. But we still haven't really answered the question. Does B&M really have a roughness problem? And I'm going to say, at the moment, probably not. But if this trend of coasters becoming rougher, then probably yes. I think while we do have a couple good examples of coasters that are way too rough for being brand new and very uncharacteristic of B&M, I still feel like we need to wait maybe a year or two for another round of new B&M coasters to come to see if they're just as rough as these ones. And I think if this next round of roller coasters coming in 2025, like Rapterra, Wrath of Rakshasa, and they're all smooth and it feels like a normal B&M roller coaster, then does B&M really have a roughness problem? Maybe not. Maybe it was just a couple off years and it just kind of culminated in some rough coasters, and then they've moved on from that and they're back to normal. But I feel like if this next round of 2025 coasters, maybe even 2026 coasters, still are having uncharacteristic roughness problems, then I would probably say that B&M could definitely have a roughness problem on their hand. And I really think the coaster to watch is Wrath of Rakshasa. If that coaster is rough, could show that these many B&M dive coasters are very susceptible to becoming rough. Anyways, I really do hope that B&M can figure out this whole potential roughness issue they might be having, because I really do like B&M roller coasters, and it is a shame to see such new coasters such as Iron Menace already having some roughness issues. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like down below, subscribe for more coaster content coming your way, and of course, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.